Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Curry's World History. So, for starters, growing the beard back, popular demand. Second, we're here at Kettle Cove. This really is probably my favorite place in all of Greater Portland. It's just the perfect little beach. It's connected to Crescent Beach in Cape Elizabeth. It's got, and Scarborough. It's just got that island off in the distance, plus the real lobster boats, and it's just a microcosm of everything that Maine is here in the south part of the state. Absolutely love it. Kettle Cove, Cape Elizabeth. I also want to mention that last time I was at Fort Edgecombe, and walking and talking at the same time, and my mind kind of spaced on some things while I was focusing on holding the laptop and not tripping. I accidentally said 1842 to 1848 for the English Civil War. Definitely not. It's 1642 to 1648. And I kind of talked a lot without keeping track of what the fill in the blanks were. So I'm going to go over it briefly one more time and then get to the real part of today's story, which is the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. Now, Oliver Cromwell took control of England after they beheaded King Charles I. He got rid of the monarchy and instead called himself the Lord Protector of the Protectorate of England. England became a commonwealth, as I said last time when we were together. Some of our states in the U.S. actually call themselves commonwealths, like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Virginia. They're all commonwealths. Oliver Cromwell is still probably the most hated man in all of Irish history, and that's because he put down several rebellions, Catholic rebellions, rebellions in favor of King Charles I, rebellions just for Irish nationalism against the English and against him in particular as the protector. He was incredibly cruel to the Irish people when he put down rebellions there, including to the town of Drogheda. He pretty much massacred everyone there because they refused to surrender when he demanded that surrender after he besieged their city. In England, he ended up firing Parliament and called himself a dictator. He ruled as a Puritan, which meant that he got rid of gambling and drinking and partying and everything that makes life worth living, right? So, he was kind of unpopular by the time that he died, and the English decided not to continue with Lord Protector anymore. So instead, they had what's called the Restoration. They restored the royal family, and Charles I's oldest son, Charles II, became the next king. It's called the Restoration. He was restoring the monarchy to rule England. Parliament didn't really want him to be an absolute monarch. They wanted him to have limits on his power and abilities. So they made him sign a guarantee that the English people would have civil rights and that he couldn't be absolute. And basically, this is the English Constitution when they forced him to sign a Bill of Rights for the people. So Charles II had to do that. He had to agree to an old Roman principle in law called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means show me the dead body. And really what it means legally is if you want to say that a crime has been committed, you have to prove that a crime has been committed in the first place before you can charge me with anything. So I could accuse someone of murder, but if there's no dead body to prove that the person has been murdered, I can't really charge a person with murdering them. If they're a missing person, for example, you can't charge a person with murder if there's no evidence that the person really has been murdered. Habeas corpus, show me the dead body. Charles II's time as king was full of trouble, full of intrigue. There was an outbreak of the bubonic plague in 1655, and then the Great Fire of London in 1666. I got a good illustration of the Great Fire of London for you in the packet, right? With all those fill in the blanks. So, he took bribes from King Louis XIV of France to join in wars to try to cripple the Netherlands, who was fighting back against Louis XIV. Charles had 14 children, none with his wife. He got around. Charles II was a bit of a player. And he had actresses and noble women and all kinds of women that he would pick as his favorite of the month and have kids with them. But he was already married when he was doing all this. So, bit of an issue, especially when a king's job is to provide a next in line to the throne, a male heir to the throne. And Charles wasn't doing that. Everyone assumed that his younger brother, James, the Duke of Albany and the Duke of York, last time I mentioned that Albany and New York State and New York City are all named for James because at that point he was the admiral of the British Navy that conquered the New Netherlands and took it away from the Dutch. But the problem is that James is Catholic. He'd had a first wife while he was publicly Protestant, and that first wife had been Protestant. He'd had a couple of kids with her. Those kids were Mary and Anne, and both of those daughters were raised to be Protestants. So because James was an old man by the time his brother Charles died, everybody thought, well, even if James is a Catholic, it'll be all right. He'll only be in charge for a year or two. What harm could he do? And then the throne will pass to his oldest daughter, Mary, who at that point had gotten married to the head of the Netherlands, Europe's most popular Protestant leader, William of Orange. Now, this is actually the time when the first ever modern political parties start. There was the Whig Party, or the Liberal Party, and they were anti-Church of England. They didn't believe the king should have absolute power, and they basically were not aristocrats. They were people in cities who were making their money by owning businesses and workshops and that sort of thing, by being doctors and lawyers and professors. So these are the Whigs. And the other major political party is the Tories, Tories, and the Tories were the opposite of everything that the Whigs were. The Tories were in favor of the king as an absolute monarch. The Tories were in favor of the Church of England. Remember, the king is the head of the Church of England, and it makes a lot of sense to say if you're pro-king, you're really pro-Church of England too. So the Tories were pro-king, pro-Church of England, and also they were, by and large, the aristocrats in the countryside who owned all the farmland. These were the dukes and the earls and the marquises who had been in charge and whose parents and grandparents had been in charge for centuries out in the countryside. So these are the Tories, those people who support the king. James II became king in 1685, and it didn't matter if you were a Whig or a Tory, he fired you. As long as you weren't Catholic, you were fired, and he would replace you with Catholics. So he, being a Catholic and now being a publicly Catholic king, was just hugely in favor of replacing all of the English aristocracy and all of the important jobs in the government with only Catholics. He wanted to restore full diplomatic relations with the Pope and abolish the Church of England so that everybody had to be Catholic again. And a lot of the Protestants who were the nobles, a lot of the Protestants, both in the Whig Party and the Tory Party, hated him for this. But they were willing to put up with it for a little while longer because he was an old man. They would try to put up with it because Mary was next in line for the throne. But the problem was that James had gotten married again, and James's second wife was Catholic. And he and his queen had a baby boy. And James announced publicly that he was going to raise his baby boy Catholic. And therefore, there would be no Protestant restoration after that. Catholics would be in charge forever and ever, and the English nobles were just not willing to put up with this. So they put a lot of pressure on James. They tried to let him know that he should probably abdicate, leave the throne. And he felt threatened, and he left the country without telling Parliament that he was leaving the country. Parliament decided that that was basically announcing that he was giving up being king. He was abdicating from the throne, and so they sent messengers to Mary and her husband, William of Orange, to say, hey, your dad has just left. He's left a vacant throne. It's all yours. William of Orange, Princess Mary, why don't you come over to England, take over the country and run it as a Protestant monarch. So William of Orange got an army together, a Dutch army, because he was leader of the Netherlands, and they actually invaded England. Now, it was with Parliament's permission, it was at their invitation, but it really was an invasion of England, because the English army, once William arrived, the English army wasn't trusted. He replaced all of the English soldiers in every fortress with Dutch soldiers. So it really was kind of an invasion by the Netherlands of England with the English government's blessing. William showed up with his Dutch army in 1688. James freaked out, and he had left the country. He decided to stay out of the country, and he went to France and set himself up as a king in exile in France. Parliament decided at this point that they wanted William to stay as the permanent monarch, so they had him sign a Bill of Rights so that he would agree to have a limited amount of power as monarch, and that English civil rights would be guaranteed in the future, and Protestants would run the country going forward. Only if he signed the Bill of Rights would they give him those powers, though. From this moment on, the kings of England and Parliament would have to compromise with each other to run the British Isles. Parliament created this small group of rulers, the smartest and most popular members of Parliament, whatever the party in charge of Parliament was, and they were called the cabinet. Okay, so this is how we get modern cabinet rule. Like, there's one person in charge of the cabinet. In this case, in England, it's a government minister who is the number one minister, the guy in charge, numero uno. We might call that prime, right? And so the prime minister of Great Britain. Today, the prime minister of Great Britain is Boris Johnson. He's the leader of the biggest political party in the House of Commons. That's how you determine who the prime minister is. English people don't vote for who's going to be their prime minister. They vote for, what party do I want to be in the majority in Parliament? And whoever is the majority party, their party leader, whoever that is, automatically becomes the prime minister. So in England, when you cast your ballot, you're not casting a ballot for president, you're not even casting a ballot for prime minister. You're casting it for your local representative to go to London, and that person makes up a part of the party in London, and whichever party has the most representatives gets their leader as the prime minister. So, interesting little thing on the side here. This was just the start of a nasty but relatively bloodless civil war in England called the Glorious Revolution, 1688, 1689. And the Glorious Revolution is where James decides he's going to get French help to try to come back and take over Britain again from his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. So he gets a Catholic French army and sails it to Ireland and gets a lot of recruits from the Irish, the Catholic Irish especially, because they hate Protestantism. And the Church of England isn't quite as bad as the Dutch Protestant version, or Presbyterians, or Puritans, like Cromwell was. So he raises an army in France, sails it to Ireland, and raises an even bigger army. And King James is looking to capture Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland is where most of the pro-English Protestants had moved to. And it was also the richest part of Ireland, and maybe, some people would say, the most beautiful part of Ireland. My family on my mom's side and my dad's side both come from Northern Ireland, if you go back to the early 1800s. One of them was Protestant, one of them was Catholic, on opposite sides of the island, which really is only about as far as it is from here to, say, Vermont. So, Maine to Vermont, not really a giant area that we're talking about, basically like a 3-hour drive. But James had raised his armies and was invading Northern Ireland. He surrounded the city of Londonderry, or Derry, depending on whether you're Protestant, Londonderry, or you're Catholic, Derry. So he surrounded Derry, and demanded that the city of Derry surrender. But the people of Derry refused. Their mayor was willing to surrender, and he actually started to get into negotiations with James and his army, but the people killed him to prevent the city from surrendering. Mayor Lundy, I think his name was. So they held out in a siege for, I think, a little under a year, being surrounded by James's army, lobbing in artillery shells into the city of Londonderry. And eventually, William's navy came over from England and Scotland and brought more supplies and more food until William's army could catch up. So William's army got sailed over, and they had this gigantic battle called the Battle of the Boyne, where William's half-Dutch, half-English army fought against James II's Catholic army, half-Irish, half-French. James's cavalry commander, which was a really important position, was a guy named Patrick Sarsfield. Now, here's where it gets a little weird for me personally, because my ancestor, who was brought over as a baby from Ireland, he was from a Catholic family, the Curry family, Curry's World History, right? So Patrick Sarsfield Curry is my ancestor. I have no idea whether we are related to the Patrick Sarsfield, who was the commander of James's cavalry at the Battle of the Boyne, or if it's just a popular Irish rebel name for those people who hate the English and those people who are Catholic, if he's like a George Washington-style hero to them. So my ancestor was Patrick Sarsfield Curry. Maybe I'm related to the guy who led James's cavalry. Either way, it was a long battle. It was an incredibly tough battle, with William trying multiple places across a river to invade in order to try to get around James's army. Eventually, James lost the battle and had to run away back to France and give up being king. The French, always wanting to hurt England, especially if England was being run by a Protestant, they kept supporting James and James's family in their claims that they were really the rightful kings of Britain. And James in Latin is Jacob. And so if you support King James and his family as the legitimate rulers of Britain, you're called a Jacobite, And my family, not only the Curry side, but also on my mom's side, a very big, powerful Scottish clan, the Camerons, were Jacobites. They supported the Stuart family. They supported James and his baby son, James III, even though he never really was crowned James III. He called himself James III. And James III's kid, Charles Edward Stuart, otherwise known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Bonnie means handsome. So he was a good-looking guy and was supposed to be good luck for the Jacobite cause. Bonnie Prince Charlie. He did invade England in the 1740s by going through Scotland first and then down through England. It was a great success at first. They got within about 80 miles of the city of London, but then everything fell apart. They retreated back to Scotland, and the Camerons, my ancestors, along with the rest of the Jacobite army being led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, got crushed on April 16th, 1746, in the Battle of Culloden Moor. Incidentally, if you've ever heard the song, My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, My Bonnie Lies Over the Sea, Bring Back My Bonnie to Me, that is for Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's Scottish people singing that they wish he would come back after having been beaten so that he could be their rightful king. My Bonnie Prince Charlie lies over the ocean, bring back my Bonnie to me. So that's the end of chapter 21. That's the end of the story of the Stuart dynasty. Remember, if you want to try to remember it this way, the first of the Stuart kings was James I, then Charles I, then Cromwell in the middle, so James, Charles, Cromwell, and then Charles II, James II. So James, Charles, Cromwell, Charles, James, and then William and Mary.
So we got England all the way through the 1600s in just 3 videos. Thanks for your patience, and I really look forward to our next big thing, which is going to be Columbus and whether he was a war criminal. Criminal against humanity, actually. Not a war criminal, a criminal against humanity. So, take care. Have a lot of fun. See you soon.